Good morning, everyone. This is Jason Dean from Film Fanatic. Hope everyone's doing good. Good morning, YouTubers. So yeah, I appreciate people checking out the videos. There's been a few videos of mine that I've been posting. I've been doing a lot lately because I've been covering. I had this whole big coverage of all of the movies that are part of the Friday the 13th franchise. I think it was about 14 movies. And it was pretty ambitious. It was a lot of fun, a little bit of work. And the coolest thing about that whole show was, watching all of the movies in succession. Started with the very first one that started it all, and then the conclusion that I finished up with was the remake, which was also called Friday the 13th, which was like kind of a spin-off to a degree, but like call it like I guess a reboot that came out about 12 years ago. And so it was great. I've seen all of the movies countless amounts of times, but I never watched every movie back to back in the sequence that each sequence following an order that each movie came out. So that was, or each year that the movie came out. So that was a really fun experience. And then I've been posting videos about little reviews and my first like reactions to watching these movies again. And again, it was interesting because I've seen all of these movies countless amounts of times, but there were a few that I hadn't seen as many as, say, part one through about part four, or the ones that I've probably seen the most. So many times that I can't even count. So I've seen all the other ones quite a few times, but there were some in the series that I had not seen before. I mean, that I had only seen maybe a handful of times. There were a few movies that really stood out, like Part 5 was really great. Jason X was a really big surprise. So yeah, it was cool. It was cool watching them all together and seeing how it all kind of fit in its weird slasher kind of way. It was cool. And I started this whole series, or the inspiration for the series was that it was announced that there's going to be more movies coming down the pike starting next year that will be a part of this franchise, because now the lawsuits and the courtroom battles are all over, so there's like a conclusion. So now there's going to be all these other movies. So I was really excited. It's probably my favorite franchise all around. There's a few really good franchises out there as far as horror movies go, but I feel like overall it's probably my favorite. Probably the most consistent in a lot of ways. I feel like, even though it's really silly, campy, and cheesy, especially the later ones, I just feel like they all kind of stick to the basic and general mythology of which the universe was created, or that world was created, and everything kind of sticks within those laws of how that kind of world goes about. And it was really interesting seeing everything back to back. And again, like I said, there was a lot of highlights. Jason vs. Freddy, that was one that I did, and then I watched. That was the second to last one that I watched. That's a tremendous movie. And there's been a few shows that I've done on this channel. And again, if you like some of these movies, or love some of these movies like I do, and you're into you know most of the stuff I do is, I like all kinds of movies, but most of the stuff I do is based in the horror realm, particularly around like the exploitation world. So, and I've seen that some of the shows in particular have been getting some pretty high numbers as far as people checking out the videos, and uh, you know Jason versus Freddy was a really big one, and then I did a show. I think it was last week or the week before about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, mostly centered on the first one. That's another really, uh, you know, uh, one of my all-time favorite films. The franchise as a whole, I could kind of take it or leave it, but I really love. There are some good ones. Part one and part two. I'm gonna watch the remake. I've only seen it once, and I thought it was okay, but I kind of want to give it another chance. Actually, the same director who made the Friday 13th reboot, which was the last movie I did, he also did the Texas Chainsaw Massacre reboot, and I really like the Friday 13th one. So I'm really wanting to. I just picked up the Texas remake. I've seen it once or twice. I thought it was okay, but I was a few years ago. But I just picked it up recently on DVD, so I'm excited to watch it again, give it another shot. Because sometimes, you know, your first initial reaction, you might have preconceived notions as to how you think the film is going to be or play out, or especially if it's a remake. There's a lot of hit or misses with that concept. There's definitely some exceptions. I think like the Evil Dead remake, the classic remake of the Sam Raimi movie, was actually really really good. Took it in a really different direction. The other one I thought was really great that I can think off the top of my head. There's a great one of the greatest vampire movies uh, one of the greatest vampire movies I think ever. Let the Right One In, which is just an incredible uh, vampire movie. And there was a remake of that is actually really really great, and it's very different. It's not. It's pretty original. It pays homage to the original, but then it does something different. I'm trying to think of other ones that are really good, but those are two that I can think of off the top of my head that are just like really great. So I'm gonna give the new Texas, even though it came out quite a few years ago, I'm gonna give that another shot really soon. I might watch that tonight, actually. So yeah, so if you like this stuff, you like these weird movies, and I kind of more or less I try to spend time and my focus and my energy with Film Fanatic, or all things Film Fanatic, with the Instagram page and also the Facebook page, and now the newer YouTube channel. I try to put the focus on films. Like if you like slasher films, you like horror films, I like to trace back things, back to maybe where their origins are, like certain directors that are out there that are pretty popular, like say Sam Raimi, for instance, like maybe movies that influenced him, or you know, movies that came out around the time that say Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out, or when great example Friday 13th, which were commercial like huge. Commercially they were huge hits, but there was also like thousands of movies that came out during that time also that were not very successful, that were to a degree even more underground, had less distribution, but they kind of all fit under the guise of the exploitation world. And a lot of those movies tried to basically copy hits of the time. Case in point, Friday 13th, that was modeled off of Halloween, which was a big, huge commercial hit. So I like to try to keep the focus with these shows and the pages on films that are pretty underground, somewhat obscure, a little bit more, definitely way more low budget, but I think they're all there's so many great hidden gems that I'm discovering uh, that that are all related to like the horror exploitation world. And typically, like I love films that have gigantic budgets too. Marvel, and I like James Bond. I love the big blockbuster movies too. I mean, for me, it's like either a movie in my world for me to enjoy it is either going to take me away for those 2 hours, or it's going to kind of just wash over me and I'll kind of check out after maybe an hour and I'm not really invested in it. But if it does, and it takes me out of the everyday ordinary experience, and it helps me escape for a couple hours, regardless of genre or budget. That's kind of where I'm at, and so I don't really discriminate as far as like if it's good, it's good. I don't really feel there's a difference, but I do feel that like with a lot of these grindhouse exploitation films, sometimes the films can be maybe to a degree a desired taste, or you might have to be in a certain kind of mood to watch them. For me, not really. It's really I just love them. They're typically a lot of these films have such incredibly low budgets. They were obviously they were modeled off of a commercial hit to a degree, so they were exploitive in nature, but they tend to be super low budget, a lot of terrible acting to a degree, but there's a lot of charm and there's a lot of humor in a lot of the films, and they also, on the other side of things, maybe to a degree on the more serious spectrum, they kind of hit on a lot of super taboo subjects, as far as darker themes, and so there's a cool balance of where there's at times there are these like incredibly disturbing subjects that some of these films will deal with or kind of tackle, but yet they're super hilarious and goofy, and they have this weird juxtaposition of being completely you know kind of serious at times, and they have these aspects of where they're incredibly disturbing, incredibly creepy, or just generally hard to watch. But then they're the campy side. On the campy side of things, there's the obvious, incredibly low budget. The actors were kind of just going for it, and the director, they weren't really, say seasoned professionals, but they had a lot of heart in what they were doing, and they just tried to go for it. They didn't do a lot of takes. They didn't have very much money, but there's a certain kind of charm and aesthetic around that I just am really attracted to. So that's kind of the primary focus for these shows, is to kind of bring light to certain films and things that I really really love. I love them also because they tend to be incredibly raw and just kind of low down, dirty, and kind of nasty. Whether they're like car exploitation or sex exploitation, in particularly a lot of the Italian classic, all the great Italian exploitation films, Lucio Fulci, Mario Bava, Dario Argento. There's so many great ones. So yeah, they're great. So this brings me to this movie that I did a show when I started doing a lot of these video shows. Or my first attempt of doing kind of live video reviews, if you want to call it that, was about a year ago. I started doing these Facebook Live shows on my Facebook page. And basically I would talk about the movie and give a little, background of like how I discovered the movie, or what the movie kind of means to me, or inspirations that movie has like given me, and just basically how the experience came to be. So I did a show on this film here, The Tourist Trap. This was one of the first movies I did on Facebook Live. As far as like movies that are considered like quote unquote grindhouse or exploitation movies, I mean, again, I love. That's kind of where my head has been at for a long time. I've always loved these movies, but because all of these companies have just been popping up, Vinegar Syndrome, Blue Underground, Severin, all of these great companies have just been popping up, left and right the last few years, and they've been reissuing a lot of these, weird movies that were at one time in complete and total obscurity, kind of to a point of where they were never to be seen again. But there was always an audience for people who were like, serious, videophiles, or serious collectors, or like into the seeing a lot of obscure kind of weird movies. So there's always been an audience, but now you have all these companies that have kind of emerged the last 4 years or so, and there's like a demand for a lot of this stuff, and it's crazy. So they've been reissuing a lot of these movies on Blu-ray, and they've been getting, just amazing treatment, Blu-ray 4K, and they. The other thing that's so awesome, I'm a huge fan of special features. Like if I dig a movie quite a bit, I'm really interested. You know, I'll probably check out that director and check out his other films, and I get really interested in the process of how some of these great movies kind of came about. And one of the cool things, that's one of the best trends I think of a lot of these reissues, is that they're usually packed with all kinds of interesting interviews and documentaries about how these particular movies were made. So it's kind of like, to a degree, I feel like I'm like going to school, film school, and just learning about how a lot of these weird, obscure movies were made that, you know, in a lot of ways that I kind of grew up watching as a kid, on VHS. And a lot of these movies were also on cable at one point. So part of it is revisiting and watching a lot of movies that I grew up and buying them, after watching them for years on like crappy VHS tapes. And now they have these, immaculate productions where they're all restored on Blu-ray. It's pretty astounding. And then plus to learn about how a lot of these weird films were made is just super interesting. And it was a real unique, kind of period in movie history when so many of these movies came out, particularly late 60s, 70s, especially late 70s and the early 80s. That was the kind of the golden era for all of these kinds of films. There are still, I guess you could say, modern films that come out that are very much in that style, that kind of to a degree are, if you want to call it retro, but they pay homage to that style of filmmaking where it's like, ultra guerrilla style, and just, shooting in locations where you don't have any permits, and kind of doing things almost to a degree almost illegal to get your film made, and doing things that filmmakers now could not get away with. So that's part of the charm also, and the allure for me is also that, and it adds a lot to the rawness. But Tourist Trap, as far as like, I guess you could say, grindhouse cinema, exploitation movies, I'd have to say that Tourist Trap is probably my favorite film. This was a movie that I watched, it was on cable, and it always, I remember the first couple times I saw this as a kid on cable, it gave me nightmares. And it was one of the first movies that legitimately gave me nightmares. And it's hard to believe that this movie, it came out in 1979, and it was directed by David Schmoller. It starred Chuck Connors, Jocelyn Jones, John Van Ness, Robin Sherwood, and Tanya Roberts. Tanya Roberts, pretty famous actress as far as the in the world of exploitation. She was in quite a few other films. I did another show a while back on this other movie called Forced Entry. She was also in that. She's been in a bunch of other movies. Beautiful actress, but she kind of made a career of making all of these like totally weird, low budget movies. And she's one of the stars in this. And this came out in 1979, and this movie had one of the strangest kind of histories. And the music for this film is just so incredible. Pino Donaggio, he did did the music, and I think it's one of my favorite soundtracks of all time for, and also, if you want to call it a score, it's also, I think it's one of the greatest film scores ever. Super creative, and it really captures the essence of the kind of the scary, creepy, horrific nature of the film, but yet it's super silly and kind of ridiculous. And there's things about it that don't make any sense, and it's kind of laughable. But yet on the other side of the other side of, or the other on the other spectrum, it's incredibly creepy and haunting. And this film came out a few years after Toby Hooper had released Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And David Schmoller was also from Texas. They both actually, David Schmoller and Toby Hooper, who directed Texas, they also went to the same school in Texas, the same film school. And so basically, Texas had come out, and it was one of the first movies where it had this incredibly low budget, and it was super gritty and raw, but it was a huge commercial hit. So basically, David, Schmoller had this idea, like, let's try to, you know, make something in that vein. Let's make a horror movie with in that style and try to make some money off of it. And so he was, you know, he was successful in school because he got a lot of grants in college, in the at the university that he went to in Texas. So he had a little bit of clout as far as being able to get financed. He got scholarships, and he was originally trying to move into doing television productions. But when Texas came out and it was a huge hit, him and his crew of people decided to try to like really make a film and try to exploit it and try to make something out of it. And a lot of the same crew that was on Texas was also part of this movie. The as far as on the technical side, and the thing that happened with Tourist Trap that was so strange and so like weird was when the film was all done and it was all completed, and it was all, and they were ready to get it distributed and to have it shown to the public. David Schmoller had felt that they had made a pretty good or good quality horror film that was creepy and scary, and the ratings back then, especially in the 70s, early 80s, really, it still has an effect obviously now on films, but back then I think it had a real deep effect. Like depending on what rating you got for a film, really was gonna give you a lot of access or give you that green light to get good distribution or not get good distribution for a film. So they felt that they had a good film that was like at least rated R, kind of modeled off of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And but after it was reviewed by the board, it got a PG rating, and which was so incredibly strange because it doesn't. And one of the reasons is because it doesn't necessarily have lots of gore or blood or lots of naked, you know, teenagers or high school kids, or not high school kids, but like college girls. They There wasn't a lot of nudity and there wasn't copious amounts of blood. It got a PG rating. So at that time, the movies that were really successful in the horror exploitation world usually always had R rating, at least an R rating or beyond, and then those were put in the same circuit of those kinds of other films, other exploitation films. But this, for some reason, because of that, because of those reasons, this film was not given an R rating. So when it was released, it basically had a very limited release. It couldn't get into a lot of markets. It couldn't get into a lot of theaters because of that, and it essentially died in the box office. But David Schmoller was able, during that time, he was able to strike up a deal with basically television, and he was able to get the movie, because it was PG rated, he was able to get it into syndication on television. So once it got into syndication, it was like constantly on. Like I think there's a really cool interview with David Schmoller on this disc. There's not a ton of special features on here, but it's only like 20-25 minutes, but there's an amazing interview with David Schmoller, the writer and director of the film, and he really goes into detail about how the whole film came about. But after he struck up this deal with cable and television, it went into syndication. So Tourist Trap was like regularly shown on Saturdays, like Saturday mornings and Saturdays and on weekends. And then I think over time it was expanded to other days, but it was mostly centered on where it became like it would play during the hours that typically Saturday morning cartoons would be playing, and which is so bizarre to me. And I, that's that was the first time I saw Tourist Trap was on cable as a kid, and it gave me nightmares because it's like I watched it again last night, and again I've seen this movie so many times I can't even count. Um, it was funny, uh, you know, I used to see this movie all the time as a kid, well, because it was on cable. And then for years and years and years and years, I kind of forgot about this movie. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, I was over at my folks' place, and like I've talked about, my parents, my mother in particular, she's always been into horror films, and she'd picked up a DVD copy of Tourist Trap, and I remember I went over to her house one day, and she's like, "Hey, do you remember this movie Tourist Trap?" And I was like, "Wait, I think I do. I think I do remember that." And we ended up watching it that night or something. And she's like, "This movie is so terrible. I don't know if you remember it. I think you saw it as a kid a bunch of times, but it's." But she watched it, and she's like, "This is like such a piece of garbage." And and I remember we watched it, and and I watched it with my girlfriend at the time. She had never seen it, and we watched it at the house with them, with my folks. And I was like, "Wow, yes, I completely forgot about this movie. How much, how just completely insane this movie is." And then she's like, I don't want this, DVD anymore." And she's like, you should have it." So she gave it to me. She didn't want to watch it. And I remember we watched it like 3 or 4 times after that. And my girlfriend at the time, she had never seen it or heard about it, and she thought it was completely, on one side, completely, utterly ridiculous and super cheesy and so terrible. But at the same time, there were sequences in the film that were just so incredibly disturbing. And so it had this really cool juxtaposition, and there's all these great mannequins, and the whole premise of the story is really interesting, and it's got this whole like supernatural uh, element. But she thought, wow, like overall, like this is a pretty trippy movie. And I, after I got the DVD copy, my mom gave it to me. I fell back in love with this film, and I was just like, this movie is so amazing. And then about 2 years ago, I was at Bull Moose in Brunswick, Maine, and I saw that they had the Blu-ray copy of it. And I was just like, no way! I couldn't believe it. And then it had special features on there and all this stuff, and it was all remastered. So, so I bought it. I scooped it up right away, and I've seen it. I don't know how many times since then. But it's a shocking thing that this thing was on cable, because I remember there are certain sequences in this film. Again, it's like completely absurd. It's completely ridiculous, and so bad on so many levels. But there's got the story is really interesting, and the whole like creep factor for this film is through the roof. There's some scenes. There's one scene in particular, without giving it away, because you need to see this film if you haven't seen it, that I feel is like one of the most disturbing, bonkers scenes ever in film history. I just feel like it gets under your skin every time. It gets under my skin. And I just watched this again last night, and I was like thinking while I was watching, I was like, wow, like thinking about what it was like to be a kid, and this movie was on cable, for free, and you could watch it all the time on television. And I'm like, this movie is like definitely one of the more disturbing movies ever made. And it's not gory, it's totally psychological, but it's just completely insane. And it's, I think in some ways, it's like what, true nightmares are made of. And for a kid to be, experiencing this film, you know, as a child is just wild. And the fact that this movie got a PG rating is just like, it's just wild to me. And, since, and then after that whole period, the movie came out on Blu-ray, and it's been reissued like about think like 3 or 4 different companies have put this out on Blu-ray, and there's like 3 or 4 different editions. There's like a collector's edition. I'm pretty happy with this copy, but there there's been about 3 or 4 editions, and there's an interview. The interview, like I mentioned before, with David Schmoller, the director and writer. He talks about how like this film was like completely, off the radar for so long. It went. He had it didn't do anything in the box office, and then when it went to cable and television, it started generating revenue. He started actually making quite a bit of money, and ended up being very successful. And then it kind of went off, years and years later, because this was like '79. It went, left cable, and then it went to total complete obscurity. And then he was saying how over the years, David Schmoller went on to become a director after this film. This was his first movie, and he directed a series of other movies, like all, kind of low budget films, but movies that were probably a little bit more, um, had a little bit of a bigger budget than compared to this, and he had some success, but it started his career for what it was, and but after it basically went off cable, the Tourist Trap went into like complete obscurity. Like nobody knew about it anymore for a long time. And David Schmoller was talking about over time, like when social media started emerging, and he started like a Facebook page, and then there was somebody had put up a page, or I think he was involved with the page about Tourist Trap, and there were like message boards. There's somebody put up a website. He started getting, once that started to emerge, like with social media, he started getting all these emails, and on all from all these people from all around the world that were like really interested and loved Tourist Trap, and they were like, when is this movie going to come out on DVD, or when is this, how can we see this again? And over time, there was like this huge audience that built itself up from nothing, and eventually it propelled the idea of the movie was re-released on DVD, and then the popularity of it just grew and grew over time, and now there's like Blu-ray, there's multiple Blu-ray versions of the film, and now it's like looked at as like this really, still very much underground, but it's looked at as a very kind of popular movie as far as films that came out of the exploitation world. It's grown on to it grew to have this huge fan base, and it's wild, and it's all due to one of the pluses and one of the great sides to technology, and that people's tastes are people's tastes, but if you get the chance to revisit something that you were exposed to as a child, and it really kind of got into your skin, and you really enjoyed it, you'll revisit it, and it connected with people again after a long period of time. And for me, it was like a nostalgic thing, obviously, but I generally I fell back in love with this film, and it's so today it remains my favorite as far as like in the world of like exploitation horror films. This is my favorite, and like I said, I watched it again last night, and I was so taken back by how creepy this movie is. It's so creepy. It's got some of the creepiest imagery ever, and Chuck Connors. It's got the classic. Chuck Connors was a real popular actor at one point, and he was a professional baseball player. But then his career, I think he was in the television show Rawhide for a long time, and he was a pretty popular actor for a long time. And then his career was not doing very well, and then he ended up, he was the star of this film, so it was this really weird time that all of these weird stars aligned to make this movie, and then it followed this strange trajectory, and now it's kind of considered a classic amongst people who are into these strange films. And so, yeah, if you don't, if you like really amazing and you like really strange, bizarro exploitation horror films, this is the movie. Um, and I also feel like this would be a good, almost starting point. Like if you like these movies that have ultra, like say you don't know, like maybe you grew up and you like horror films, but you kind of grew up watching, say, um, you know, like say The Conjuring, which is a great movie, and if you're like a younger generation, and you've watched like the Conjuring movies, or you've watched Annabelle, and all those other spin-off movies, like the more uh, Hollywood-based horror films, which I love, and say you've never really checked out older horror films from like the 70s or 80s, and particularly like the low budget obscure movies, but then if you're open to checking out things that are a little bit more underground, and you've never seen anything quite in that world before, I really feel like Tourist Trap would be a really, really awesome starting point. Because if you like this kind of thing, it has incredibly low budget. The acting is pretty bad, but the story is kind of interesting visually, and the aesthetic around the film um, is so kind of intriguing. Even though on one hand it's like completely absurd and ridiculous, doesn't necessarily make sense, but at the same time there's like this thing of where it's um, really fun and just like a good time, but then it's also kind of disturbing and incredibly strange, and it's really really raw, and it's kind of got this dirty thing about it. If you are open to that, or looking to get into things of that nature, film wise, this would be a great starting point, because then I feel like if you checked out this movie, there's there's literally thousands upon thousands of other films that are kind of in this genre, um, that you could be exposed to, and that's kind of what happened to me, where a lot of films, particularly like Tourist Trap and films by Lucio Fulci, um, some Dario Argento films. There were, like a lot of those films I grew up watching on VHS. And within the last few years, that seeing it, a lot of these films got incredible releases on Blu-ray. I've been buying a lot of them, and then it's part of its nostalgic, out of nostalgic reasons. But then I find myself really enjoying these films again, and it's amazing. And I'm like, wow, okay. And then I start looking at the racks of where I buy these movies, and then other directors that are kind of similar in style. Then I go down this rabbit hole, and then I have discovered that there's also thousands of movies I have not seen that are in this style, and it's been really great experience. So this is Jason Dean of Film Fanatic. So if you get a chance, please like and subscribe to this page, Jason Dean YouTube, Film Fanatic, and yeah, very exciting time to be a movie fan. So thank you again, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.